Today we are talking about bike gears. Now, they might sound complicated, but if you learn to use them properly, can make a significant difference.
Hang on, Heather, I'm really sorry, but what on earth is so complicated about bike gears?
Mark, I don't want to be the one to point out, but you are currently cross-chaining and there is a hill that we're about to go up, so you might want to change that.
It's a little bit harsh here, but I was actually just about to put it into my small ring.
Well, if you don't know quite what we're on about here, don't worry, we're going to be explaining everything about gears to help you ride more effectively. Let's start by taking a closer look at the gears. Now, the front set of gears here by the right-hand pedal are the ones that can make a significant difference. You usually hear them called the chain rings, and a bike can have 1, 2, or sometimes even 3 chain rings. And the chain is then shifted between the chain rings by the front mech, which is found just above here. And that's then controlled by shifters, usually on the left-hand side of the aero bars, the base bar, or the handlebars. And the smaller the chain ring, the easier the gear.
But over at the rear of the bike, we have the cassette, which has more cogs, meaning more gear choices, and therefore smaller changes between the gears. Now, I've currently got an 11 speed on my bike, meaning 11 cogs, but you may have a 10 speed, a 9 speed, an 8 speed, or maybe even a 12 speed if you've got a nice fancy one on your bike. Now, unlike the chain rings, actually the smaller cog, which we have here, is actually the hardest gear, meaning the most resistance. Then the largest cog here is the easiest gear, meaning the easiest resistance. Then below that, we have the rear mech or derailleur, which allows us to shift between those cogs and gears. And that is all normally operated and controlled by controls on the right-hand handlebar or aero bars.
Okay, let's look at how you actually change between the gears, because there is a certain knack. I mean, you could just bulldoze your way through from your biggest cog to your smallest cog in a few seconds, but your bike components aren't going to thank you.
No, they're not, and you also do run the risk of jamming your gears in the process. So instead, you should try to change one gear at a time, slowly kicking your way up or down through the gears and making sure that you pedal between those changes. Now, you'll also notice quite a big difference if you actually ease off the pedals ever so slightly whilst you change. And I know that might sound really quite odd, particularly when you're trying to push hard and you're going up a hill, but you will actually really notice the difference with a bit of practice. Now, I'm not saying fully come off the gas or off the pedals, but just a well-timed release of pressure on the pedals will make a world of difference.
Yeah, and the best way to figure this out is to go and experiment. So find a nice quiet road that's just undulating and practice changing gear and then changing the amount of pressure you put down at various points. Whilst we're on the topic of shifting gears, there's something you want to avoid, and that's cross-chaining, which Mark demonstrated nicely in the intro. Now, not only is it a big no-no in cycling, it's actually because it's also going to be ruining the components of your bike.
Yeah, it is. Now, what's happening when you're cross-chaining is, well, you might be in your largest chain ring at the front and then your largest cog at the rear, which is obviously your easiest gear. Or the opposite, you could be in your smallest chain ring up front and then your smallest cog at the rear, which is your hardest gear. So essentially the opposites. And what's happening here is you're putting your chain through quite a large angle, which is going to potentially stretch it. You might damage the components and also the risk of dropping or slipping your chain.
Well, now we've covered the basics and the ground rules, it's time to look at how to optimize our gears, and that leads me on to cadence. Cadence is measured in revolutions per minute, otherwise known as RPM, and finding the right RPM will in turn help you to ride better.
Yeah, now in short, the higher or the harder the gear, the higher the resistance. And generally speaking, unless we're absolutely flying along or we're descending, that's going to mean that our legs are going to turn over more slowly. So less leg revolutions per minute and therefore a lower cadence. But alternatively, if we're in a lower or easier gear, it's going to have a weaker resistance and therefore our legs are, generally speaking, going to turn over more quickly. We're going to have a higher cadence.
Yeah, well, cadence is very much a personal thing, and some cyclists prefer to have a higher cadence, others a lower, but generally speaking, a good kind of figure to aim for is somewhere between 80 and 95 RPM, and you'll find that good sports watches or bike computers should be able to measure this, and then you can display it so you know that you're on track.
Yeah, now over time you will get used to this and learn your cadence for yourself and not have to refer to sports watches or computers quite so often. And you'll even get to the point that you'll be able to adapt. So as your cadence lowers, you might be able to shift quickly into an easier gear, or as your cadence gets higher and you start to spin out, you shift into a slightly harder gear. Well, it's all very well in theory, but we all know that out in the real world, out on the road, things can feel a little bit rushed. We don't spot things coming. We don't realize quite how long a climb is, or maybe even how steep a climb is. So this is where we need to start looking ahead and being observant and almost preempting those gear changes. So take this hill, for instance. You shouldn't just come into this hill, plow in the same gear that you were on the flat and just hope for the best, because what's going to happen is your cadence will lower and then you'll end up grabbing your gears and shifting through a load of gears really quickly and really inefficiently, and potentially even jamming the gears, as we mentioned earlier. Instead, you want to enter this hill, start preempting it and preempting your gear changes. So as you approach the hill, start changing gear. That may even mean shifting into your smaller chainring whilst you're putting less pressure through the pedals. And then as you come into the climb, you can start shifting through the rear cassette and through those smaller gears incrementally as the hill gets steeper.
Well, shifting down through the gears isn't actually just for the hills. You also want to consider it if you're coming up to a junction or traffic lights, because say you've been steaming along in a fairly big gear, you then come to a stop. Pulling away in a big gear is going to be incredibly hard, so just think about it ahead of time and shift down a few gears.
Now the same applies for corners. Try to read the road ahead of you and change gear accordingly, rather than just heading into a corner in the same gear and then struggling to accelerate out of the corner. Instead, as you enter the corner, as I'm about to do now, just shift down a couple of gears, go around the corner and make my life a heck of a lot easier.
As we've already talked about, selecting your gears, choosing your cadence is very much a personal preference. It's not one size suits everybody, so it's a matter of finding out what suits you.
Yeah, it really can take a bit of trial and error. So what I suggest is you head out, you try out a number of different cadences until you find out whichever one suits yourself. And what you'll probably find is that some cadences feel a lot more taxing than others, in which case you'll probably want to avoid them going forward.
Yeah, and don't forget, you can also change the gearing on your bike. You don't have to stick with what it came with from the shop. And say you've got a hilly terrain race coming up, you might well want to change your gear ratios. And the easiest thing is to change your cassette. Not that I've done it personally, but Mark has, and we've actually got a video on how to change your cassette just down here.
Yeah, and if you'd like to complement that and find a little bit more about gear ratios, you can see our video on gear ratios explained by clicking just down here. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're not doing so already.